In front of every worker in that building, a senior manager grabbed the cleaner by his collar, slapped him hard across the face, then lifted his bucket of dirty mop water and poured it straight over his head. She looked down at him dripping on the floor and said, "You poor fool, worthless, useless. You are nothing but a common cleaner. Stay down there on the floor where you belong." Workers laughed, phones came out, nobody moved, nobody said a single word. The man said nothing back. He simply picked up his mop and continued cleaning. But what nobody in that building knew was that the man kneeling on that wet floor owned every single thing inside it. And what happened after that would leave the entire company in complete shock. It was a cold Monday morning. Rain hammered against the glass walls of Apex Group Holdings, while workers rushed through the entrance dragging water and mud across the shining tiles. Right there in the middle of the chaos, David was already on his knees cleaning the floor. His faded cleaner's uniform clung tightly to his body, while both hands gripped the mop handle. He moved carefully, quietly, like a man used to being invisible. Workers stepped through the section he had just cleaned without even acknowledging him. One man almost kicked his bucket and cursed under his breath before continuing toward the elevator. David simply moved the bucket aside and continued working. For 4 months, he had cleaned those exact floors every single day. He knew every leaking pipe, every broken office light, every hallway that flooded when rain fell too heavily. He knew the names of workers who had never bothered learning his. He moved through the building like a shadow, necessary but unseen. At exactly 8:14, Mrs. Adairs stormed through the entrance, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, her heels striking the floor sharply as if she was angry at the building itself. She did not notice the wet floor sign. She did not notice David kneeling nearby. Her heels suddenly slipped across a damp tile and her body jerked sideways. Hot coffee splashed down the front of her expensive cream-colored suit and onto her shoes. The entire entrance froze. Slowly she lifted her head and turned toward David, her face twisted with fury. In 2 quick steps, she crossed the distance between them, grabbed his collar violently, and yanked him upward so hard his neck strained. Before anybody could react, her palm crashed against his face. The sound echoed across the lobby. Conversation stopped instantly. David's mop slipped from his hand and clattered against the floor. Brown water spilled across the tiles from the bucket beside him. Mrs. Adairs' breathing grew heavier as she pointed directly at him. "You idiot," she shouted. "Can you not do one simple thing properly?" Then, before anyone could stop her, she grabbed the mop bucket and emptied the dirty water straight over David's head. Workers gasped softly, while others immediately pulled out their phones to record. Dirty water ran down David's face, soaked through his uniform, and dripped onto the floor beneath him. Mrs. Adairs looked down at him with disgust. "You poor fool," she said loudly, "worthless, useless. You are nothing but a common cleaner. Stay on the floor where you belong." A few workers near the reception desk laughed nervously. Nobody stepped in. Nobody defended him. David remained silent. Slowly, calmly, he bent down, picked up his mop, and resumed cleaning the exact same floor. One person in the room could not look away. Deborah had witnessed everything from beside the staircase entrance. She saw the slap. She saw the humiliation. She watched the dirty water pour over him while everyone stood there doing nothing. Her chest tightened painfully as she watched David continue mopping the floor with complete silence. She walked directly toward him and knelt beside him on the wet tiles without caring that her office clothes were getting soaked. "Please," she said softly, "let me help you." David paused and turned toward her. His eyes were calm, too calm for a man who had just been humiliated publicly. It was the look of somebody carrying a secret nobody else could understand. He slowly shook his head. "I'll handle it," he replied quietly. "Go upstairs." Deborah hesitated for a moment before standing. She looked back at him one last time before disappearing through the staircase door. 4 days later, an announcement echoed through every speaker inside Apex Group Holdings. A major international company was offering a multi-million-dollar partnership deal. One staff member would represent Apex during the final interview, and whoever secured the contract would receive a huge promotion. Immediately, the entire atmosphere inside the company changed. Employees became desperate to impress management. Offices stayed busy late into the evening. Everybody wanted the opportunity. Deborah sat alone in her office long after most workers had left. Her computer screen was filled with incomplete proposal drafts she kept deleting repeatedly. She had all the statistics and numbers, but something still felt wrong. Nothing she wrote sounded powerful enough. Frustrated, she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Then she heard the familiar sound of a mop bucket rolling slowly down the hallway outside her office. Moments later, David appeared at her doorway. "You're writing about what your company needs," he said calmly. "But that's not what closes big deals." Deborah turned toward him in surprise. David leaned lightly against the doorframe. "Big companies care about one thing," he continued, "what both sides gain 10 years from now. That's where you begin." Deborah stared at him silently for several seconds. Then she slowly turned her chair back toward the computer. "Come in," she said quietly. "Keep talking." For over 2 hours, David stood near the doorway while Deborah typed non-stop. He spoke about long-term partnerships, trust, leadership, business psychology, and negotiation strategies with shocking precision. His understanding sounded nothing like a cleaner. Deborah listened carefully while her respect for him grew stronger every minute. By the time she finished typing, her weak proposal had transformed into something extraordinary. When she finally looked up again, David had already disappeared. The next morning, Deborah submitted the proposal. 45 minutes later, the director emerged from the boardroom, holding her file. "Miss Deborah," he announced loudly, "you've been selected to represent Apex Group Holdings." Workers immediately crowded around, congratulating her while management shook her hand repeatedly. Across the room, Mrs. Adize clapped slowly with a tight expression on her face. Far down the corridor, David quietly pushed his mop bucket around the corner and disappeared from sight. The interview took place 3 days later, inside a massive conference hall filled with executives from several international companies. The questions were brutal and relentless. Candidates stumbled repeatedly under pressure, but Deborah remained calm. She answered every question with confidence, speaking exactly the way David had taught her. She focused on future value, mutual trust, and long-term growth. By evening, the results were announced. Apex Group Holdings had won the partnership deal. Deborah had secured the contract. That night, the company erupted into celebration. Music played from several offices while workers danced and congratulated one another. Food covered nearly every desk. Deborah smiled politely through it all, but her eyes constantly searched the room until they finally landed on David. While everyone celebrated, he quietly moved through the building, collecting empty cups and cleaning tables like none of it involved him. Something shifted between them after that night. Deborah began finding excuses to spend time near him. She brought him tea during late shifts. She waited for him after work. They talked quietly in empty corridors long after other workers had gone home. One evening, she finally asked where he lived. David remained silent briefly before agreeing to show her. They drove far outside the city until the roads became rough and narrow. David directed her toward a nearly abandoned area where broken houses stood hidden in darkness. Finally, he told her to stop the car. Deborah followed him through tall grass toward a crumbling structure barely standing upright. The walls were cracked badly. Plastic sheets covered missing windows. Rainwater stains covered the ceiling. Inside the house sat only 2 broken chairs, a weak yellow light bulb, and a thin mat lying on cracked concrete. Deborah stared at the mat quietly. "You sleep here?" she asked softly. David nodded once. "I manage." Deborah slowly sat down on the floor beside the mat without saying another word. David looked genuinely surprised. He stepped outside briefly to buy drinks from a nearby shop. When he returned moments later, he found Deborah still sitting there calmly beside the window. "You stayed," he said quietly. Deborah smiled faintly. "You sound surprised." Rain soon began hitting the damaged roof above them. Water leaked through 2 holes in the ceiling. Without even looking up properly, David reached for empty buckets and placed them beneath the leaks automatically. Like a man completely used to hardship, they talked for hours that night about life, about loneliness, about people pretending to be something they were not. Eventually, Deborah fell asleep beside him on that thin mat, while rain echoed softly across the broken roof overhead. 3 weeks later, David suddenly stopped coming to work. Deborah immediately noticed his absence. She called his number several times but received no answer. Worried, she drove to his house after work. She pushed open the weak metal gate and entered the room quickly. David lay on the mat, sweating heavily with fever. Empty water bottles rested beside him while his breathing came in weak, shallow movements. Deborah rushed toward him and touched his forehead. It burned beneath her hand. "David," she whispered in panic. His eyes opened halfway. "I didn't want to bother you," he murmured weakly. Deborah immediately pulled him up and carried him to the car. She took him straight to her apartment, cared for him day and night, gave him medicine, cooked for him, and barely slept while watching over him. Every single time David opened his eyes, Deborah was there beside him. By the 7th day, his fever finally broke completely. Their connection deepened quietly after that. Neither of them said what was growing between them, but both of them felt it. Then came the morning everything changed forever. The atmosphere inside Apex Group Holdings felt different from the moment workers arrived. Security guards stood straighter, fresh flowers decorated the reception area. Senior executives moved nervously through the hallways. Rumors spread quickly that the owner of the company was finally returning after several months away. By 9 o'clock, every employee had gathered inside the massive conference hall. Nearly 200 workers filled the room completely. David arrived earlier that morning with the cleaning crew as usual. He quietly cleaned the hallway outside the conference room while workers walked past him without attention. Mrs. Adiza barely glanced at him while entering the hall. Deborah looked directly at him as she passed, and something silent moved between them before she continued walking. Moments later, the director stepped onto the stage. The room immediately fell silent. "Please stand," he announced proudly, "and welcome the founder and owner of Apex Group Holdings." Every employee rose from their chairs simultaneously and turned toward the giant double doors at the back of the hall. The doors slowly opened. One set of footsteps entered the room. Calm, steady, familiar. David walked through the doors wearing a perfectly fitted black suit. 4 senior executives followed behind him respectfully. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Shock spread across the room like wildfire. One worker accidentally dropped his phone onto the floor. Mrs. Adaze's face lost all color instantly. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The same cleaner she had humiliated publicly was calmly walking toward the stage as the owner of the entire company. Deborah stood frozen with tears filling her eyes as memories flooded through her mind all at once. The wet floor, the broken house, the fever, the nights talking together, the man everyone ignored had been watching them all the entire time. David stepped onto the stage and took the microphone calmly. His eyes slowly scanned the silent room before finally stopping on Mrs. Adaze. "Mrs. Adaze," he said evenly. Her entire body stiffened. "For 4 months I cleaned the floors of this building. During that time you publicly humiliated me, slapped me across the face, and poured dirty water over my head in front of every employee here." The room remained deathly silent. "Your employment with Apex Group Holdings ends today. Leave your access card at the front desk before leaving the building." Mrs. Adaze stood completely frozen for several seconds before slowly lowering her head. Without speaking, she turned and walked toward the exit while every worker watched silently. The sound of her heels striking the floor echoed painfully across the room until the doors finally closed behind her. David then lifted his eyes again and searched through the crowd until they landed on Deborah. His expression softened immediately. "One person in this building treated me like a human being before knowing anything about who I truly was," he said quietly. Deborah's tears rolled down freely. "Miss Deborah, effective immediately. You are the new Chief Operations Officer of Apex Group Holdings." The room exploded into applause. Workers jumped to their feet, shouting in shock, while Deborah covered her mouth in disbelief. But before the noise could settle, David slowly stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward her. The entire hall watched in silence. He stopped directly in front of Deborah while tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. Then gently, softly, he reached for both her hands. "You believed in me," he said quietly, his voice filling the room, "when the entire world saw only a cleaner with a mop." Deborah shook her head emotionally while trying to hold back tears. David smiled faintly. "You stayed beside me when you thought I had nothing. You cared for me when nobody else would. You saw me before you knew who I was. The room stood completely silent, watching them. David slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps instantly filled the hall. Several workers covered their mouths in complete shock. Deborah's entire body trembled as David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet ring box. "Deborah," he said softly, "I spent 4 months testing the people in this company. But somewhere along the way, I found the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." Tears poured heavily down Deborah's cheeks. "Will you marry me?" For 1 second, the entire hall seemed frozen in time. Then Deborah nodded emotionally while crying harder than before. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The entire conference hall erupted violently with applause, cheers, and shouting. Some workers screamed in excitement while others wiped tears from their eyes. David stood up slowly, placed the ring onto Deborah's finger, then gently pulled her into his arms and kissed her in front of the entire company. Shock spread through the crowd once again before the applause became even louder. Deborah held onto him tightly while tears continued falling down her face. David looked into her eyes calmly with the same quiet expression he carried the very first day she knelt beside him on that wet floor. The difference now was that everybody else finally understood exactly who he had been all along. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional and powerful stories like this every week. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to see every country supporting this channel today. Also, if you were Deborah, would you have helped David when everyone else ignored him?